Thank you, World First Council, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be with you all today. And as a journalist who has reported on different human rights atrocities around the world, the most important thing that we're asked to do is obviously to tell the truth, what happened. And to do that, we try to interview eyewitnesses. Those eyewitnesses may be human rights workers, NGOs, people on the ground. They may be journalists. They may be the victims themselves who have survived, or victims who have been injured and who lived to say something. But the eyewitness account for a journalist is the single most important thing to get. And if you don't get it, you will be held accountable by your bosses and by the public that you are broadcasting to. In the Armenian Genocide, I work for the Armenian Film Foundation every day, and I'm not exaggerating, in this run-up to April 2015, every day we're getting requests from media organizations around the world asking, please, can you give us the moving picture of the Armenian Genocide, the movies, the film? We want to do our documentaries. We want to write our stories about the upcoming 100th commemoration. Could you please give us that moving image? And I have to say to them, the Armenian Genocide was, I guess what you could say, is at the cusp of modernity. By that I mean, there was not the phone you could hold up to record the pictures. The pocket camera that had the film on a roll that had just come out, and it was available. The moving picture, that was on a big tripod in a big box with using silver nitrate film, which was inflammable. No, there was not really a lot of moving image. There's some moving image, which is newsreel of the various heads of state. So you could see the Kaiser, you could see the Sultan, you could see occasional heads of state in an almost ethnographic way. But no, there are no atrocity moving images of the Armenian Genocide. We do have very few pictures of the deportees or the refugees from the Near East Relief Campaign. There's some pictures, and it's usually from the later part of the genocide period in the 20s. The most important images are from Armin Wegener, who was a German medical officer who took pictures, and other German medical officers. You'll see a little bit of Armin Wegener in what I'm going to show you in a moment. And there are pictures from other eyewitnesses who were not Armenians, missionaries who took pictures, Marie Jacobson. And you can actually access these on the Armenian National Institute site. They have the collections on site. So yes, there are still photographs, but there is not the moving image. What we do have are the testimonies of the survivors and the eyewitnesses who were there. Armenians, Greeks, Assyrians, Yazidis who were massacred in the same place that they were attacked by ISIS this last summer, the same location. And those people have their own personal stories to tell. And through the Armenian Film Foundation and USC Shoah Foundation, this year, we have digitized those interviews, which were recorded on film over a 40-year period by one filmmaker. We've digitized those survivor and eyewitness testimonies, and we put them up on a visual history archive, an online archive that can be accessed all over the world. You can put in a keyword and say, I want all the survivors, eyewitnesses from Harper, that place we were just talking about. And you will be able to pull down those images to the minute of where your keyword search is. You could do like a Google search. I want all the survivors from Harper. And from the entire collection, you will be given to the minute those survivor testimonies. Already in that collection, it's one of a kind, 52,000 Holocaust testimonies. 52,000. Nobody could possibly look at all those testimonies. The only way they have any meaning for you is for you to be able to do a search and pull down the things that you're interested in knowing. Testimonies from Rwanda, testimonies from Cambodia. They're bringing in testimonies from the Nanjing massacres, some from Guatemala war crimes. They will all be in one place. And although USC is a very nice university to visit, You won't have to go to USC. You can access it from Berlin or Sydney or Buenos Aires. That's how we learn. That's how we prevent genocide, by listening to what really happened, listening to a testimony, maybe a couple of testimonies, maybe 50 testimonies, and hearing firsthand what somebody experienced. They could be Armenian, they could be German, they could be Greek. You will hear it firsthand. So tonight, I'm going to stop talking and let the survivors speak for themselves.
Never. The Turkish town crier came and announced that to be ready in about 2 days, they were going to take us all to another city, just transferring people. So, we got ready, and some people didn't believe it, but in 2 days' time over, the gendarmes came with their rifles, knocking at our doors. Get out over there. We've been transferring you to another city. So whatever we could take along in a quick way, we got into the group, and that night we arrived in Malaysia. There, they separated the men and the boys over 10 years old, and one group took them to the other side of the city. Women and children in another group, just the opposite end of Malaysia. That evening, we heard shots fired. We saw the flashes of gunfire. And soon, one of the boys who had escaped came to our group and said, forget about the men, because they were all killed at that massacre. So we got to the shores of the Euphrates River. Then what they did was, the gendarmes came and picked up all the boys between 5 and 10 years old, threw them into a pile. And I happened to be one of the first ones, and I was at the bottom of the pile. After they had all the boys in this pile, they started with their swords and bayonets, killing us boys. And one of the bayonets just hit me in my right cheek here, and the blood was streaming, not only the blood from my cheek, but the blood from those dead boys, that hot blood coming all over me, and I couldn't scream or I couldn't cry for fear that they would finish the job and kill me again. That evening, we heard shots fired. We saw the flashes of gunfire. And soon, one of the boys who had escaped came to our group and said, forget about the men, because they were all killed at that massacre. So we got to the shores of the Euphrates River. Then what they did was, the gendarmes came and picked up all the boys between 5 and 10 years old.
There was a Clubfoot boy who spoke in Turkish only. He would come and shout, Ajans çok daşaklı Davidislar, meaning news, wonderful warriors. And then he would go on saying how many they had killed, how many of the enemies they had killed. And the enemy happened to be men and young boys they had taken out to dig trenches for their soldiers. And they would just spear them and threw them in the trenches. And those were the numbers that they would say how the enemy had been busted. And we found out that those men and boys were being speared and thrown into the trenches was when the young boys, 14, 15 years old, who hadn't been killed, they would dig themselves out of the trenches and come to the town holding their guts hanging out of their bellies, because the spears had made holes there and the guts would be hanging out. They had annihilated all those men and boys who had been forced to dig trenches for the soldiers. But it was never trenches for the soldiers, it was their own graves.
It's a tragic thing, and what we saw, it was sickening. Later on, we found out that we could not move into that territory anymore, that the government stopped everybody. And later on, we found out that all those people were taken further out into the desert, and what happened to them from there, it seemed like everybody knew that they were dead. They were all killed. There were no survivors that I know of.
I saw with my own eyes a poor neighbor of ours from Bandırma. She couldn't walk anymore, and they took hold of her and threw her into the burning fire. And my father's first cousin, Hasmik, lost his mind in front of us. Then we were supposed to be fortunate ones. Then we went, they put us on train again towards the Syrian desert. My baby sister died on the train there. She was only 4 years old. And my parents just buried her by the railroad tracks there. I saw with my eyes a pregnant woman among us. And because she was bleeding, the Turkish soldiers put the sword on her stomach, and the baby came out of her. And the mother died there too, right there.
Good evening. My topic tonight is genocide recognition or quest for justice. As we approach the centennial of the Armenian Genocide in a few days, on April 24, Armenians at long last are demanding justice rather than the simple acknowledgement of the mass murder of 1.5 million of their ancestors by the Ottoman Turkish government. Similar barbaric crimes are being repeated by ISIS in our own time and in the same regions of Iraq and Syria where survivors of the Armenian Genocide had settled a century ago. Let us quickly review the historic developments of the Armenian issue since 1915. In the immediate aftermath of the genocide, most of the survivors, scattered throughout the Middle East, had no food, no shelter, and barely the clothes on their back. The destitute Armenian refugees, abandoned to their tragic fate, were forced to settle in permanent exile. In those early years, their first priority was survival, fending off starvation and disease. Gradually, they rebuilt their lives in new homes, churches, and schools. Engaging in lobbying activities or making political demands were the last things on their minds. Every April 24, Armenians commemorated the genocide by gathering in church halls and offering prayers for the souls of the 1.5 million victims. Successive generations tried to break the wall of silence surrounding the greatest tragedy that befell the Armenian nation. Tens of thousands of Armenians in communities throughout the world held protest marches, wrote letters to government officials, and petitioned international organizations. The Turkish government, along with the rest of the world, initially turned a deaf ear to Armenian demands for recognition of the long-forgotten genocide. But as media outlets, world leaders, parliaments of various countries, and international organizations began acknowledging the genocide, Turkish authorities, astonished that the crimes perpetrated by their forefathers were making headlines after so many decades, pumped massive resources into their campaign of denial, funded foreign scholars to distort the historical facts, hired powerful lobbying firms, and applied political and economic pressure on countries acknowledging the genocide. Since 1965, over 20 countries, including Canada, France, Italy, Switzerland, Belgium, Greece, Russia, Poland, Sweden, Argentina, and Uruguay, have recognized the Armenian genocide. Even though it is commonly assumed that the United States has not acknowledged the Armenian genocide, the fact is that all three branches of the American government have repeatedly recognized it. The first time that the executive branch made a reference to the Armenian genocide was all the way back in 1951 in a document filed by the US government with the International Court of Justice, known as the World Court. The second reference to the Armenian genocide by the executive branch was made by President Ronald Reagan when he issued Presidential Proclamation 4838 on April 22, 1981. The legislative branch, the Congress, adopted 2 resolutions in 1975 and again in 1984, confirming the historical facts of the Armenian Genocide. Most people are unaware that the judiciary, the 3rd branch of our government, has issued 3 federal court rulings in recent years concerning the Armenian Genocide. Thus, all 3 branches of the U.S. government have gone on record recognizing the Armenian Genocide. In fact, in many respects, the United States has compiled a more extensive record of acknowledging the Armenian Genocide than many other countries that have merely adopted parliamentary resolutions on this issue. International organizations, including the United Nations, have also recognized the Armenian Genocide. The UN Subcommission on Prevention of Discrimination and Protection of Minorities adopted their report in 1985, acknowledging that the Armenian Genocide met all 5 criteria, UN criteria for genocide. 2 years later, in 1987, the European Parliament adopted a resolution, again recognizing the Armenian Genocide. In addition, hundreds of Holocaust and genocide scholars have issued joint statements confirming the facts of the Armenian Genocide. After so many acknowledgments, the Armenian Genocide has become a universally recognized historical fact. Regrettably, despite such widespread acknowledgement, there are a few remaining major countries that have yet to recognize it. Those siding with the denialist regime in Turkey are not doing so due to lack of documents or conviction, but regrettably because of political expediency with the intent of appeasing the denier. One would hope that these governments would join most of the enlightened world in acknowledging the historical facts as they are and not as the Turkish government wishes them to be. Armenians no longer need to convince the world that they were the victims of genocide. Nevertheless, simply acknowledging what took place and a mere apology would not heal the deep wounds and undo the consequences of the genocide. Armenians are still waiting for justice to be done, seeking restitution and return of their confiscated lands and properties. In recent years, Armenian-American lawyers have successfully filed lawsuits in U.S. federal courts, securing millions of dollars from New York Life and French AXA insurance companies for unpaid claims of policyholders who perished during the genocide. In 1915, a centrally planned attempt was made to uproot from its ancestral homeland and decimate an entire nation, depriving the survivors of their cultural heritage as well as their homes, lands, houses of worship, and personal properties. A gross injustice was perpetrated against the Armenian people, entitling them, as in the case of the Jewish Holocaust, to just compensation for their enormous losses. As an initial step, the Republic of Turkey should place under the jurisdiction of the Armenian Patriarchate of Istanbul all the churches and religious monuments which were expropriated and converted to mosques and warehouses or outright destroyed. It is important to remember that in considering legal recourse, one should keep in mind that the Armenian Genocide did neither start nor end in 1915. Large-scale genocidal acts were committed, starting with Sultan Abdul Hamid's massacre of 300,000 Armenians from 1894 to 1896, the killings by the Young Turk regime of 30,000 Armenians in Adana in 1909, and finally the genocide of 1.5 million Armenians from 1915 to 1923. In subsequent decades, tens of thousands of Armenians were forcefully Turkified or deported by the Republic of Turkey. Most of the early leaders of the Republic were high-ranking Ottoman officials who played a major role in organizing the Armenian Genocide. This unbroken succession in leadership assured the continuity of the anti-Armenian campaign of race extermination. Today's Republic of Turkey, as the successor of the Ottoman Empire, also has its share in the guilt. In the 1920s and 1930s, thousands of Armenian genocide survivors were forced out of their homes in Cilicia and Western Armenia and deported to other parts of Turkey or neighboring countries. In 1940s, These racist policies were followed by varlık vergisi, the imposition of an exorbitant wealth tax on Armenians, Greeks, and Jews, bankrupting the remnants of these communities. During the 1955 Istanbul pogroms, many Greeks as well as Armenians and Jews were killed and injured and their properties destroyed. This continuum of massacres, genocide, and deportations highlights the existence of a long-term strategy implemented by successive Turkish regimes from the 1890s to recent times to solve the Armenian question with finality. Consequently, the Republic of Turkey is legally liable for its own crimes against Armenians, as well as those committed by the previous regime. The Turkish Republic inherited the assets of the Ottoman Empire, and therefore it also inherited its liabilities. Finally, since Armenians often refer to their three sequential demands from Turkey, recognition of the genocide, reparations for their losses, and return of their lands, Turkish denialists have naturally concluded that once they recognize the genocide, Armenians will then pursue their two other demands. This is the main reason why the Turkish leaders adamantly refuse to acknowledge the Armenian genocide, fearing that its acceptance would lead to demands for restitution. They believe that by denying the first demand, recognition, they would be blocking the next two. The fact is that commemorative resolutions adopted by legislative bodies of various countries and acknowledgements by world leaders have no force of law, therefore no legal consequence. The Turkish government must realize that recognition of the Armenian genocide, or the lack thereof, will neither enable nor deter its consideration by international legal institutions. Once Turkish officials realize that recognition by itself cannot and would not automatically lead to other demands, they may no longer persist in their obsessive denial. Without waiting for any further recognition, 100 years of waiting is long enough, Armenians must pursue their historic rights through legal channels, such as the International Court of Justice, where only states can bring a claim, the European Court of Human Rights, as well as domestic courts. For Armenians, seeking justice means restitution and recovery of all losses from the genocide era, including communal properties such as churches, monuments, cemeteries, and schools, confiscated and looted personal assets, and the occupied territories of historic Armenia. The centennial is an excellent opportunity not just to commemorate the genocide, but to demand long overdue justice for the Armenian nation. Thank you. Thank you.
So unfortunately, I have been asked to close the evening without a Q&A because we've run out of time. But I'm certain that all of our distinguished panelists would be more than happy to continue the conversation and dialogue with you outside of this meeting. Tonight, I just want to recognize each of you and to thank you for your presentations. I think that each of you have, through these presentations, created a beautiful commemoration of genocide that happened 100 years ago. And through the first presentation, we learned, we were educating ourselves, re-educating ourselves about and keeping the historical record alive, right, of what happened. And that's an important part of justice for mass atrocities and genocide. And through Carla's presentation, we listened to the voices of the survivors. And that's so critical and important to hear the voices of those who bore witness and who suffered from these atrocities and never ever to forget. I'm so grateful that through your work, Carla, and the Shoah Foundation, we had those archives to remind ourselves continually and to keep their memory alive. And finally, with Harut's presentation, we've gotten the challenge that the fight for justice continues. The arc of justice is long, and for crimes such as genocide, unfortunately, that arc of justice can be quite long. Yes. But we must not ever give up. We must not forget. And I can testify personally, having worked with a lot of survivors and victims from different genocides around the globe, that I've seen many instances and cases where justice is indeed realized. And we are seeing justice realized in many instances with regard to the Armenian genocide, and must continue to pursue that fight for justice. So please join me in just thanking our panelists, and thank you all for coming.
Quiero